The last thing Marshal Jim Thornton saw before his eyes went black was his own reflection in a saloon mirror. Except it wasn't moving when he was. They found him 3 days later in the middle of Deadwood's main street, gun still holstered, every drop of blood drained from his body like a slaughtered hog. That made 11 dead gunslingers in 4 months, all found the same way, empty as wineskins, with that same look of frozen terror carved into their faces. I'm Deputy Sam Hartley, and I should have listened when the Lakota elder told me some hungers don't belong to anything born of this earth. Because what I found in those Black Hills wasn't something you could kill with lead and powder. It was something that had been killing men like us since before anyone drew a map of the territories. Listen close now, because what I'm about to tell you happened during the spring of 1885, and there ain't a night goes by I don't wake up in cold sweats remembering it. Folks back east think they know about frontier justice, about outlaws and lawmen, about cattle rustlers and claim jumpers. They've read their dime novels and heard their campfire tales. But those stories don't tell you about the real darkness that lived in the territories, the kind that didn't care about your badge or your reputation with a six-shooter. The Dakota Territory was meaner than a rattlesnake in those days, and Deadwood was its beating heart, pumping gold fever and violence through every muddy street and canvas-topped establishment. Men came there to strike it rich or die trying, and most ended up doing the latter. I'd been wearing a badge for 6 years by then. Thought I'd seen every flavor of evil a man could dish out. I was a damn fool. When gunslingers started dying, real professional killers, the kind who'd survived 100 showdowns, I figured we had a poisoner or an ambusher working the territory. Made sense. Coward's way to make a name without facing anyone fair. But the way those bodies looked, drained white as January snow with expressions like they'd stared straight into hell itself, that should have told me we weren't dealing with any ordinary murderer. Now, before I take you deeper into this nightmare, do me a kindness. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how this tale unfolds. Drop a like if you're brave enough to hear the rest. And down in the comments, tell me what country and city you're watching from, because I want to know how far this story travels from those cursed Black Hills. The killing I'm about to describe ain't for the weak of stomach. The smell hit me before I even reached the body. That peculiar sweet rot stench that means a corpse has been ripening under the Dakota sun for more than a day or two. Marshal Thornton lay sprawled in the dirt like a discarded puppet, arms and legs at angles that suggested he'd simply collapsed mid-stride, and the flies were already doing their grim work around his eyes and mouth. I knelt beside him, fighting back the bile rising in my throat, and that's when I noticed his skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality, like you could see right through to the bones beneath if you looked hard enough. "Sweet Jesus," muttered Doc Brennan behind me, his medical bag hitting the ground with a thud as he stared at what used to be one of the fastest draws in 3 territories. Thornton's gun was still in its holster, the leather strap fastened tight, which made no goddamn sense for a man who'd killed 17 men in fair fights, and probably twice that many in unfair ones. His eyes were open, staring up at nothing, but the expression frozen on his face wasn't peaceful or even pained. It was pure, distilled terror, the kind that comes from seeing something your mind can't comprehend. Doc Brennan rolled up his sleeves and began his examination, pressing fingers against Thornton's neck and wrists, peeling back an eyelid, checking for wounds or marks that might explain how a healthy 40-year-old killer ended up dead in the street. "Sam, come look at this," the doc said after a few minutes, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before, and he was pointing at 2 small puncture wounds on Thornton's neck, barely visible beneath the collar of his shirt. The wounds were neat, precise, like someone had driven ice picks into the flesh with surgical accuracy, but there was no blood crusted around them, no blood at all, which struck me as peculiar given how much a neck wound typically bleeds. "That's the 11th body with those same marks," I said, pulling my notebook from my vest pocket and flipping through pages filled with witness statements, death reports, and my own increasingly desperate theories about what was killing these men. Doc Brennan's hands were shaking as he closed his medical bag, and I'd known him long enough to recognize that wasn't from the whiskey he drank to steady his nerves. It was genuine fear, the kind that seeps into your bones and won't let go. 11 men in 4 months, all of them experienced fighters, and not one managed to draw his weapon "Or call for help," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the morning chill that still clung to the streets. I stood up, dusting off my knees, and scanned the empty storefronts and shuttered windows. Folks were watching from behind their curtains, but nobody wanted to come out and face whatever had turned their main street into a graveyard. The pattern was unmistakable now, laid out in my notes like a death sentence written in ink. Every victim had been a gunslinger, every body drained of blood, every face twisted in that same expression of absolute horror. "Get him to the undertaker," I told Doc Brennan, then started walking toward the edge of town where the Lakota elder named Chaska had set up his camp 3 weeks prior, appearing like smoke on the wind right after the 8th killing. The old man sat cross-legged outside his hide tent, working on a piece of leather with a bone needle. And he didn't look up when my shadow fell across his work, just kept stitching like he'd been expecting me all along. "You've come because another hunter has been hunted," Chaska said in English smoother than most white men spoke, his weathered face remaining fixed on his handiwork. I felt my jaw tighten because I hadn't told anyone I was coming here, hadn't mentioned Thornton's death to a single soul except the doc. Yet somehow this old Lakota knew exactly why I'd walked the half-mile from town. "What do you know about these killings?" I demanded, my hand instinctively moving toward my revolver before I caught myself. Threatening an elder wouldn't get me answers, and besides, something in his calm demeanor suggested my gun would be about as useful as spitting at a tornado. Chaska finally looked up at me with eyes black as river stones, and what he said next made every hair on my neck stand straight up. "Your people brought this thing when they dug too deep in the Black Hills, woke something that has been sleeping since before the grandfathers of my grandfathers walked this land. Something that feeds on the spirits of violent men." Chaska set down his leather work and gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, partly from stubbornness, partly because my legs had gone weak at the implication that we'd somehow unleashed this nightmare ourselves. 3 winters before the yellow-haired general died at the Greasy Grass, prospectors found a cavern deep in the Black Hills, the old man began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting history that had been burned into memory. "They pulled gold from that hole for 2 seasons before they broke through into something older, a chamber that had been sealed with stones carved with warnings in a language even our eldest medicine men could not read." I finally sat down in the dirt across from him, my notebook forgotten in my pocket, because what he was describing lined up perfectly with something I'd heard whispered in saloons. Stories about the Hellmouth Mine, a played-out claim up in the hills that no prospector would work anymore. "The first men who entered that chamber never came out," Chaska continued, his eyes distant like he was seeing events that happened years ago playing out right in front of him. "Their partners found them 3 days later, collapsed at the entrance, every drop of blood gone from their bodies, their faces frozen in screams that had no sound. The similarity to our current situation hit me like a mule kick to the chest. Same drained bodies, same terrified expressions, same impossible question of how something could kill experienced armed men without a struggle. "The mining company sealed that shaft," I said, remembering the conversation I'd overheard at the assayer's office. "Dynamited the entrance and posted guards to keep people away, claimed it was unstable, that the whole mountain might come down." Chaska shook his head slowly, a grim smile creasing his weathered face like cracked leather, and his next words confirmed the terrible suspicion that had been growing in my gut since I'd knelt beside Thornton's corpse. "They did not seal it to keep people out, Deputy. They sealed it to keep something in. But 3 months ago, an earthquake opened new passages through the mountain, and now the thing that sleeps in darkness walks among your towns at night, feeding on those whose hands are stained with the blood of other men." I left Chaska's camp with a piece of paper clutched in my hand, a rough map he'd drawn, showing where the old Hellmouth Mine connected to a series of natural caves that the earthquake had torn open like wounds in the mountain's flesh. Every logical part of my brain screamed that I was chasing superstition and old wives' tales, that there had to be a rational explanation for these killings, but logic couldn't explain how 11 armed men had died without firing a single shot. I gathered my supplies that afternoon while the sun still hung high. Rope, lanterns, oil, matches, my Winchester rifle, extra ammunition, and a silver crucifix my mother had given me before I left Missouri, which suddenly seemed less foolish to carry than it had that morning. The only person I told about my intentions was Doc Brennan, who looked at me like I'd announced plans to fly to the moon, then wordlessly poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass and slid it across his desk toward me. "If you're not back in 2 days, I'm telling Sheriff Bullock you went mad from the stress," he said, but there was respect in his eyes, the kind you give a man who's walking towards something terrible because somebody has to. I rode out at dusk, guiding my horse up the winding trails into the Black Hills, while the sun painted the rocks blood red and shadows stretched long across the pine-covered slopes like grasping fingers. The entrance Chaska had marked on his map was a jagged crack in the mountainside, partially hidden by fallen timber and brush, narrow enough that I had to leave my horse tied to a tree and squeeze through sideways with my pack. Inside, the temperature dropped 20 degrees immediately, and my breath came out in visible puffs as I lit my first lantern. The flame guttered and danced like it was struggling against something more than just drafts of air. The passage descended steeply, the walls pressing close on either side, and I could see where recent rockfall had cleared away decades of accumulated debris, creating a pathway that hadn't existed before the earthquake struck. I'd been walking for maybe 30 minutes when I found the first body, a prospector by the look of his tools, dead perhaps 2 weeks, drained white as chalk, and wearing that same expression of horror that had become sickeningly familiar. His empty eyes staring at something in the darkness that I couldn't see but could definitely feel watching me. I forced myself to search the prospector's body with trembling hands, finding nothing except a journal, whose final entry read, "It's beautiful and terrible," like looking at God and the devil having the same face, which did absolutely nothing to calm the panic clawing at my chest. The passage opened into a massive cavern that my lantern couldn't fully illuminate, and the darkness beyond seemed to press against the light like something solid and alive, swallowing the weak flame's reach after only a few yards. The walls were covered in carvings, not the crude scratches of bored miners, but intricate symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them directly, telling a story in pictures of something that fed on human essence, that grew stronger with each violent soul it consumed. My boot struck something metal, and when I lowered my lantern I saw scattered across the cavern floor were weapons, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, knives and tomahawks and old flintlock rifles, some so ancient they'd rusted into unrecognizable lumps, evidence of how long this thing had been killing. That's when I heard it, a sound like wind through a canyon, except there was no wind down here, and the sound carried words in a language that hurt my ears, syllables that twisted in the air like living things trying to burrow into my skull. The lantern flame turned blue, casting everything in a sickly, pale glow, and I saw it then at the far end of the cavern, a shape that my eyes couldn't quite focus on, something that existed in the space between shadow and substance. It moved toward me with a grace that was utterly wrong, flowing rather than walking, and as it drew closer I could make out features that suggested it had once been human, perhaps thousands of years ago, before whatever transformation had turned it into this feeding thing. My hand went to my revolver but froze there, because I understood with absolute certainty that bullets would be useless against something that wasn't entirely present in the physical world. This creature existed partially in whatever dark realm the carved warnings had been meant to keep it imprisoned within. The thing's voice filled my head without using sound, showing me visions of all the men it had taken. I saw Thornton's final moments, watched him stand paralyzed as the creature fed on not just his blood but something deeper, draining the violent essence that had defined his existence, until only an empty husk remained. I stumbled backward, my boot catching on a skull, and fell hard against the cavern wall just as the creature lunged forward. But instead of finishing me, it stopped abruptly, recoiling from something, and with dawning horror, I realized my mother's silver crucifix had fallen out of my shirt and was now hanging visible against my chest, the metal glowing with a faint light that seemed to cause the thing genuine pain. I didn't remember climbing back through those passages. My body moved on pure instinct, while my mind tried to process what I'd witnessed in that ancient chamber. and when I finally emerged into the pre-dawn light, I collapsed beside my horse and vomited until there was nothing left inside me. The creature couldn't be killed, but Chaska had been right about one thing. It fed exclusively on violent men, on gunslingers and killers whose souls were already stained dark with blood, which meant the solution wasn't destroying it but starving it by clearing out every murderous bastard from the territory before they became its next meal. I rode back into Deadwood and wrote my report, though I left out the parts nobody would believe, and within a month we'd run off or arrested every known gunslinger within 100 miles. The killings stopped after that, but I know it's still down there in the darkness, waiting patiently in that sealed chamber, because things that old don't die, they just sleep between feedings, and someday some fool will dig too deep again and wake the hunger that's been hunting killers since before this land had a name. That's my story, and I'm carrying it to my grave. The question that haunts me ain't whether that thing is real. I know it is. The question is how many other horrors are sleeping in the deep places of this world, waiting for men greedy or foolish enough to disturb them. Sleep well, friend, and if you ever find yourself in the Black Hills, stay out of the abandoned mines.